Hello, welcome back to the Marrow Thieves. Today I'll be reading 3 chapters, starting with the chapter Found, and that's on page 161. So that's chapter called Found on page 161. For the second time in what seemed to be a very long life, I was woken up by the crash and yell of confrontation just outside my tent. Oh, hell no! I jumped up this time, gun already in hand. Slopper, don't move! I crept to the flap, heard Rose cursing outside, and unzipped it enough to get a one-eyed peek and to push the barrel of the gun out. Instead, a barrel poked in from the outside. Shit. That's right, boy. I'll be taking that. Someone yanked the zipper up and over the curve, and the flap folded inside. The man, his face covered with a red bandana and dark sunglasses, pulled the gun out of my hands. Now put your hands right up in the air where I can see them. I was furious with myself. Disarmed while I was still on my knees? It was like I hadn't learned anything since Riri. I raised my hands, palms out to face height, and folded myself up and out of the tent. I stood my ground in front of my captor, keeping my gaze narrow and pinned on my reflection in his shades. He stood tall, and I couldn't be sure if he even bothered to look at me until he said, "That's right. You can give me the evil eye all you want, boy. Just keep those hands in the clear." Still staring, I yelled out, "Chi boy?" "Yeah," he answered from somewhere to my left. "Everyone okay?" "Okay, we're all here." A second man came into view, his face similarly covered, and pulled Slopper out of the tent behind me. The boy grumbled and flopped onto the ground beside me, pulling the second man over with him. "Jesus, kid, be careful." This one was female. Hard to tell with the getup they had on, layers of dark clothes and faces covered. The one guarding me laughed a bit. "Who are you?" I was pleased to hear my voice remain steady. I got no response except to be pulled by my sweater across the clearing and pushed to sit beside the rest of the group. I saw 2 more bandana-clad intruders. These 2 held crossbows at waist height, not really aiming them anywhere, though they were loaded. Everyone looked to be fine, not tied up or roughed up. Flopper was placed beside me. Our captors stood in front of us, lined up in their bandanas and sunglasses. "French," Miig called to me from the other end of our lineup. "Remember that carving in the woods?" "That's enough, old-timer." The female guard kicked at the sole of Miig's shoe. I looked down the line at him. He pointed at the intruders with his lips. I raised my eyebrows. These were the people who'd left the carving? The one who knew the old syllabic system. He nodded and he leaned back into our respective places. I cleared my throat. "I think you're who we've been looking for." No answer. "We need help." One of the figures holding a crossbow snorted. "Don't we all, little cousin? Don't we all?" So Miig was right. They were indigenous. "Maybe we can help each other." The woman answered this time. "We don't need help from anyone. Nobody helps nobody no more, and we certainly don't need help from you. Probably working for the schools, little snitches looks like." I addressed her, shrugging. "How do we look like snitches? Do we have new clothes or good weapons? Are we too well fed?" She glanced at Slopper, whose shirt hem didn't quite connect with the waistband on his jogging pants. "Lady, we've seen snitches." I paused, lowering my voice a bit, readying myself to yell it out. "We've killed snitches." They all looked over at me now. There was no boastful pride in my face, just 5.5 years of hard living. One of the guys with the crossbow leaned into the female to whisper, and she turned and jogged away from the camp. Rose shivered against my shoulder, and it was the first time that morning I'd realized she was right beside me. It was warm now, coming on May by Miig's calculations, but the mornings were still bitey and she was in her pajamas, an old t-shirt and a cut pair of long johns. Keeping my eyes on the guard directly in front of me, I slowly raised my arm and placed it over her shoulders, drawing her into me, the other hand still raised at face level. There was no protest from either of them. "Getting real sick of these mornings," Wab grumbled. Just then the female jogged back. Behind her, an older man followed. His face was not covered at all, and he was very clearly niche. In fact, there was something about him that was familiar beyond the general. I flipped through the pile of faces in my memory, but couldn't solidly place him. Maybe we'd run into him for a day or a meal out on the road? So, who are you then? He stood in front of us, hands clasped at his back, so that his impressive paunch greeted us first. His question wasn't unfriendly. Miigwans Kiwenzi Anish Dikaz. Miig spoke first, giving him his full name. The man opened his eyes real big. Get up, please. Then he gestured to the guards around him. Help them all up, please. These are our guests, not our prisoners. Could have fooled me. Wab was still bitter as she stood, brushing off the grass off her back of her faded sweatpants, the initials of a university she'd never attended stamped across the seat. And help them pack up camp. They are joining us for breakfast. He turned on a heel and left the same way he came, without waiting for a reply from any of us. What if I don't want to join you for breakfast? I challenged, stepping into the space between me and the guard who disarmed me earlier. I was still sore about that. He laughed into his bandana, then pulled it down to reveal a smile wide with white teeth. Come on, little cousin. I'll help you pull up camp. Later on, I might even let you have your gun back. He pulled down his hood and revealed a head of long, dark hair, pulled back into a ponytail at the nape of his neck. I flushed hot. Turned out this guy was not much older than me, and his arrogance was unbearable. I'm not your cousin. It was all I could manage before he cut me off to address Rose, still at my side. Though I'd much rather help you. He gave her one of those big smiles, but I'm sure you are quite capable. I am very capable, she responded, before walking back to her own tent. I was a little upset that she hadn't given him more attitude than that. We don't need your help at all. I tried to lace my words with poison, but that only made him laugh. Suit yourself. He wandered off to chat with his friends, several of whom had also pulled down their bandanas. Asshole. It was under my breath, but I still said it. I packed quickly, shoving and stuffing instead of folding away. I placed bags puffy with chaos by the doused fire pit and joined Miig at his site. I rolled up his tent around the pegs while he carefully folded his blankets. Who do you think they are? I didn't bother to whisper. We'd been left largely alone while the intruders chatted by the fire pit. I cringed to see the asshole using my tent bag as a seat. Not sure yet, but I do know the old guy. You do? I spun around to face him. Who is it? Did we meet him on the road? No. He was slow to answer. I can't be sure right now. He was being evasive, and that, on top of being sassed by someone my own age, frustrated me. I left him to finish up and joined Rose, who was now dressed in a pair of jeans and a gray shirt. She had braided her long curly hair in one thick rope that fell over her shoulder. Even now, I couldn't help but notice how beautiful she was. She saw me and smiled me over to a stump where she'd helped prepare supper the night before. You're a mess. Sit down. My own braid was 2 days old and tufts stuck up here and there. She untied the bottom and pulled it apart. I noticed the asshole watching us, a peculiar look on his face like jealousy, and I smirked. She brushed my hair hard and rebraided it for me. Much better than a stupid ponytail like some people. I felt real Nishan. Ready to go now, I followed Miig's lead and walked behind the newcomers into the woods. Despite our recent tragedies, he seemed less stressed about this new development than I was, though I was still acutely aware of my missing gun. They walked us through the bush in a semicircle and then southeast. After about a half an hour, we arrived at a tree-lined hill and stopped. What the heck? There's not even anything here. Slopper sat on a rock, exhausted and cranky at having to wait for his breakfast this long. Look closer, big man. One of the crossbowers clapped his hands, and two bodies in camouflage stepped out of the trees at the base of the hill. Bows pointed at us. These are the guests coming to join us, he called out, and they stepped back into the trees. We walked towards the hill, and now I could see a cave carved into it. This is where we went, single file into the hill itself. I felt panic when we'd gone through the door, past more guards and into the dark. I thought of Riri and Minerva then, and aggression filled my limbs like adrenaline. Miig put his hand on my shoulder and I deflated, but only just a bit. The cave opened into a low, wide room filled on both sides with tents and makeshift abodes of impressive structure, panel walls, blanket doorways. The space was clean and orderly with a hum of activity. Children were gathered in one corner, taking turns reading from a paperback book under the stern eye of an older woman who watched us with a face that revealed no interest as she shushed the children back to work. Some faces appeared in the doorway of the homes, but they quickly disappeared. We were a quiet sensation. We were led to the back of the cave and into a smaller tunnel than the entrance, one of four branching off the back wall. I hesitated at the mouth and had to be pushed forward by Rose, who walked behind me. We're good. All good. What if we're not? I whispered back. Nothing we can do about it anyway. There's too many of them. This was very true. We were kind of screwed if they turned out to be recruiters or traders or some kind of cannibal tribe like the Twins Wendigo people. She left her hand on the small of my back, and I reached behind it to grasp it in mine. I decided right then that I might be okay with dying at this point. I had lived. I recalled the moment we found water, and even here in this tunnel, with the potential of being eaten by cannibal Indians still undecided, all the blood rushed away from my head. At first I thought that this was what made my eyes squint, what made them take in too much light. But then I saw we were coming to the end of the path and daylight was up ahead. We emerged into a valley surrounded on all sides by high walls of smooth rock. It was about 30 meters in diameter and the ground was lush. Here the grass and the weeds were sharp and thick and grazed our shins. I was so busy looking down and holding onto Rose's hand that I forgot all about being anxious. Then I smelled it. Tobacco, cedar, and a thick curl of something more, something I thought I'd only ever smelled with the memory of smell. Hola, that's sweetgrass. Rose slipped into her old accent, picked up from years with the elderly before she'd come to us. We grow sweetgrass here. It was the man from the woods. That's what you see all around you. He was smiling, patting the tips of the longer strands we stood in. Miigwans, he approached us, arms open. We are so pleased to have you with us. When the council gets out of the lodge, we'll all talk. I looked back to where he pointed, against the far stone wall. There at the base was a squat, round structure, piled with layers of old blankets and tarps. In front of it burned a low fire in two piles, one of wood and the other of round rocks. Is that a sweat lodge? I could barely breathe. An honest-to-God sweat lodge? Here in this weird valley hidden by stone hills? Where the hell were we? Then I heard the other word, council. Council? Just then the flap on the front of the lodge was opened. A gust of steam poured out in like a giant's breath, and men started to crawl out. One by one, naked to their briefs, old and young, native men came out on their knees and stretched back to full height. Each one smiled our way, and Miig started to smile back. He smiled so big his eyes almost disappeared into the folds of it. The last man out of the lodge took an extra minute to stretch out to his full height. He leaned heavily on the man beside him, and I saw that the bottom half of his right leg was missing. I was distracted by it, too distracted to look into his face until he spoke. Francis? His hair was longer, and his face sagged a bit more at his hard jaw, and then there was the missing lower half of his leg. But there he was. Dad? I crossed the distance between us with my packs still strapped to my back. I don't remember when I pulled them off. All I know is that when he threw myself to the ground and into the circle of his arms, I was small again. No baggage, no years in the bush, no murder. I was small and he was huge and everything was okay. We cried together like that, happy in a way that had no words, till he suddenly pulled back and scanned the group behind me. And I knew what he was looking for. I caught his gaze and shook my head slowly. Then we cried for a different reason. Time moved slowly and quickly, and we didn't care. Eventually, we were sitting at a round table on stumps and rocks, all level to the same height. I sat between my father and Miig, who had embraced, as they made introductions between their respective groups. This is the council, what's left of the original one, and newer members we picked up along the way. Dad went clockwise round the table. Clarence, Cree from the old prairies territory. Mint, Anishinaabe from South America. Bullet, she's Inuit. Jojo is Salish and she came to us just last month. This was his introductory sweat we just had to bring him onto the council. General is Haudenosaunee and Mi'kmaq, and Rebecca is Ho-Chunk, also from across the border. 7 of us all together. They were passing around a copper vessel, sharing water that embroidered the outside with beads of cool condensation. Miig spoke for us. He knew some of the men there, but not all. It was different. Usually we spoke for ourselves, but I could tell some protocol was set aside. The group was worn out from their sweat, and everyone, not least of all me and Dad, was drained and emotional. He was quick, pointing out around the table to our faces with his palm up. Chi-boy, Wab, Rose, Ziguan, and Tree. I'm Miigwan's. Slopper, and this is Jean's boy, Frenchie. He paused. There's 8 left. Left? Bullet, who was clearly blind in one eye, turned towards Miig. You've had some recent losses? Yes, I'm afraid so. Our little girl Riri passed on in the middle of a kidnapping attempt. Damn traitors. And our elder Minerva was taken from us by recruiters. Bullet's head swung to her right. The older man with the yellowed mustache, General, leaned in to whisper to the small man with the bald head they called Mint. What? What is it? I asked the table. It was my dad who answered. We've heard of your Minerva. What? Where is she? Chi-boy used his seldom heard voice and sprang from his chair as if he would run to her right that moment. That's why we came this way, to try to find her. We thought someone in Espanola or thereabouts would have some idea which school we could go to try to find her, Miig explained. General and Mint whispered again before the older man answered. She's not in a school. She's here, in town, I mean, in Espanola. Okay, so the next chapter is called Miracle of Minerva, and it's on page 171. The council had a man on the inside, so their information was good. They told us what they had learned of Minerva after she was taken away from us. We had been wrong about the marrow, but not about the theft. 3 recruiters drove an Anishinaabe elder, female, to school number 47E, the school closest to the Espanola settlement. She was compliant, jovial even, and recruiter number 1 noted in his log that there might be something fatally wrong with the subject's mind. She hummed on the 5-hour drive in and began singing in increasing volume as they processed her, cutting her hair, shaving her skin, scrubbing her body, and preparing her to be hooked up to the conductor. Sensible words, English words, could not be made out, and she refused to answer any questions, not that that was integral to the process. All they needed was to insert the probes, tether the wires, and begin the drain. Recruiter number 2 left hallway through the preparation. He'd been on the job for over a decade and had never encountered someone as so spooky, in his own words, and suffered nervous twitching that spread to his bowels. He rushed to the washroom on the 7th floor, sadly in a removed area of the building without a local fire escape, sealing his fate in a stall filled with his own anxious stench. Really, the recruiters were just there as added sentries at this point. Being at the delicate cerebral stage, it was time for the headmistress to take over and the cardinals to carry out the procedure. Recruiter number 3 stayed to satisfy his sadistic nature. Recruiter number 1 slouched off to sleep at his desk behind the storage closet with its cages of balls and padding. He didn't find this part interesting. The chase was the crux. After that, who cared how the savages screamed or cried? The recruiters would later be identified through dental records. Minerva hummed and drummed out an old song on her flannel thighs throughout it all, but when the wires were fastened to her own neural connectors and the probes reached into her heartbeat and instinct, that's when she opened her mouth. That's when she called on her blood memory, her teachings, her ancestors. That's when she brought the whole thing down. She sang. She sang with volume and pitch and a heartbreaking wail that echoed through her relatives' bones, rattling them in the ground under the school itself. Wave after wave, changing her heartbeat to drum, morphing her singular voice to many, pulling every dream from her own marrow and into her song. And there were words in the language that the conductor couldn't process, Words the cardinals couldn't bear, words the wires couldn't transfer. As it turns out, every dream Minerva had ever dreamed was in the language. It was her gift, her secret, her plan. She'd collected the dreams like bright beads on a string of nights that wound around her each day, every day until this one. The wires sparked, the probes malfunctioned, bodies rushed around the room in the flurry of black robes like frantic wings beating against mechanics. The system failed all the way through the complication of mechanics and computers, burning each one down like the pop and sizzle of a string of Christmas lights, shuddered to ruin one by one. The council's man on the inside was called to school number 47E the day after the incident to take stock and investigate. He noted that several indigenous people were on site, camping around the edges of the property, while it still burned, low now, but full of thick smoke, unafraid of the inhabitants and curious as to the cause of destruction. Gossip spread fast. The school had been imposing, a fallacy of glass and steel against the dusty expanse of the North Shore clearing, like a middle finger thrown into the sky, built in record time. Now it was nothing more than one story, maybe two, of jagged edges, melted poles, and broken cement. A spew of office chairs, smashed computer parts, and chewed up bricks lay on the ground around it. The fence was mostly thrown down, but the fortified gates still stood. When the council's man exited his black vehicle and walked the remaining path to the gate, strewn with debris from the explosions and subsequent fires, and maybe even some looting, the campers moved in closer. Soon the road behind him was dotted with spectators following him to the useless gates, holding nothing from a broken system, torn down by the words of a dreaming old lady. The wind shifted so that the heat and smell bore down on the road, and with the council's man watching, the campers made their hands into shallow cups and pulled the air over their heads and faces, making prayers out of ashes and smoke. Real old-timey. Okay, so this next chapter is called Loss, and it's on page 175. That night we slept in the clearing. We chose to stay outside. Inside seemed too claustrophobic, and besides, we were more than happy to be close to the lodge. Sun, plenty of room in my place. I'd helped my dad to his place and had waited in the main living space while he went behind a screen to change and get ready for bed. His spot backed into a natural corner in the cave so that two of the four walls were stone. The other two had been crafted with a wooden frame hung with wool blankets. The structure had a roof, an old hospital blanket that sealed in the idea of privacy if nothing else. In the space was a cot and a small shelf made from planks of wood separated with cut logs and filled with books, folded clothes, papers, and some braided and bunched herbs. His rosary beads hung from a corner of the shelf, and in between a pile of sweaters and a stack of spineless books was a framed plastic ID card. I went in close, checking that he was still busy behind the screen first. It was my mother's health card, the green plastic embedded with white letters that spelled out her name, Mary E. Dewson. Sex, female. Date of birth, 03/15/2027. Issued, 04/11/2049. The rectangle for her picture was harder to make out. It was dark with age and wear, like she was standing in the shadows even then. He returned, his eyes half closed even as he spoke, leaning on a carved crutch that curved under his arm like a smooth cradle. The reunion, the sweat, the long day had all taken their toll. He wore a pair of gray sweatpants and a droopy wife beater that showed the sagging skin on his arms and the strength still hard in his chest. It also revealed a series of scars knotted like bark up his side, around his back, and climbing up his neck into the back of his hairline. Nah, I'm okay. Just gonna help the crew with their stuff. Maybe I'll sneak in after? He nodded, pulled me in with one ropey arm for another hug, and patted me hard on the back, digging his chin into the crook of my collarbone so that I knew he was working out the reality of my physical presence. I turned to leave, pausing at the exit. Dad? Yeah? He was lowering himself onto a cot. Mitch gave himself to them so that I could get away. Mom couldn't. Dad hung his head, perched on the edge of his cot, knuckles flat against the mattress like a resting gorilla, so that his shoulders sat high by his ears. He didn't say anything. It was too much right now. Maybe soon we can talk about them, hey? Real soon, French. He kept his face tilted towards the floor. Real soon. I was exhausted, but we needed to talk. The others knew it. When I returned, they were already sitting at the fire. Someone had thoughtfully helped Slopper with his tent, and he was already passed out inside of it. I could hear his reedy snore through the canvas. You staying out here? Tree seemed surprised, but also a bit relieved. Yeah, I'm still a part of this family, aren't I? Yeah, Zequan answered. It's just that you have a real family now. Real? What's that supposed to mean? You're not real? I picked up a stone by my foot, so this won't hurt then. I chucked it at him through the fire. Ow, geez. He rubbed his shin where it had bounced off his shin. All right, we're real, we laughed. So we need to figure some things out, I guess then. I addressed Miig, who was sitting up very straight, staring into the low flames. No, not really. I was surprised by his answer. What do you mean? It was Rose. Don't we need a plan? Sure we do, he replied, but the end is the same. We are going to get Minerva. French was led here by that belief, and it turned out to be a good one. Minerva is close by, and he found his dad. That's a pretty overwhelming sign we're on the right path. I think we expected more hesitation, and maybe a story or seven about what happened at the schools. Not that Miig was weak or cowardly, not at all. Just that we expected him to be more skeptical, to calm our feverish ambition, to be the voice of steadfast reason. Instead, we found a tired old man and a cooperative soldier, all wrapped up in one Indian. It was like he had faded somehow. I just mean the dreams, the words. Don't we need to talk about Minerva finding the key? She didn't find anything. She always had it. Maybe we just need better listeners. I pressed him. What about strategy, a plan? Shouldn't we be mounting an attack now, while it's dark? This isn't my territory. Tomorrow we can meet with the council and figure things out from there. He yawned and walked out of the ring of light thrown by the fire. Right now, I need sleep. We're off too. I wasn't sure Tree and his brother had picked up on the subtle shift in Miig. They stood and made their way over to their tent, more in unison when they were tired than any other time. I noticed their cap was on neither head. Maybe that was it. Maybe we were all just exhausted. It had been another day on the run, another day being woken by the strangers in our space, and then at the same time a day unlike any other we'd had. Hell, I was tired. Wab started the work of putting out the fire safely, but she had an odd serenity in her movements. Cheeboy began his unusual end of the night patrol. I turned towards the steady drone of Slopper's snore before Rose grabbed my arm just above the elbow. Can you come to my place for a minute? The invitation knocked some of my anxiety out of my limbs. I rarely got to spend time with Rose. We were a sad, rushed bunch these days, but the slightest touch and I was right back to being a teenage boy with the biggest crush in the world. I thought maybe it might be more than a crush, what with that afternoon by the river, but I couldn't be sure. Everything was hot and cold and horrifying and hopeful. Terror is an odd bedfellow. Sure. I crawled in the tent after her and was immediately struck by how empty it was. There was one bedroll in the middle of the space, against the back wall were her bags, one open with a couple of pieces of clothing pulled out. Beside her bed was a small solar-powered lamp that cast a moon glow that didn't quite reach the corners. And here I could smell the angst and earth and awkward of my own body, and I was embarrassed. I stayed by the door while she crawled to the back wall. You okay? I wasn't sure I was. Yeah. That's crazy, eh? Finding your dad? Yep. She examined my face for a moment before continuing. I think Miig is a bit worried. About rescuing Minerva? I started to pull off my sweater. It was warm in here. No. She tilted her head and thought. No, I don't think so. I think it's more about you. Me? I paused, my sweater halfway over my head. What about me? Well, you've changed. I was quiet. Had I really changed after all? I didn't feel changed. I just felt less. Or maybe it was more. Not changed so much as living at a different volume. And I think even though it's great that we found your dad, well, you know what happens when we find family. Now she sounded worried. She dropped her beautiful face so that the waves of her hair covered half of it. I wanted so badly to move it aside. I wanted so badly to kiss her again, and I wanted to tell her I wouldn't leave, that I would never leave, but I couldn't. The memories I carried from the days I'd had with my parents were kept in cradle boards in my mind, situated in a complete safety, even the bad ones. In them, there was always this feeling, an understanding more than an emotion of protection. It didn't matter what was happening in the world. My job was to be Frances, that was all. Just remain myself. And now? Well, now I had a different family to take care of. My job was to hunt and scout and build camp and break camp to protect the others. I winced even thinking of it. My failure, I'd failed at protecting, and now, as a result, I failed at remaining myself. Maybe I would stay. Maybe it would be the only way I could keep my sanity, to stay with my dad and inch my way back to Frances. She made her way on hands and knees across the bed and over to me. I won't ask you to come with us, French. I wouldn't do that to you. She was right in front of me now, her face an inch from mine. She smelled like sweetgrass and a deeper smoke, despite the shock of finding my dad, the odd behavior of Miig, the confusion of the new place and how we arrived, the stress of Minerva's impending rescue. All I wanted to do was kiss this girl, so I did. She didn't pull away, and so I leaned in until we were pushed back onto the layers of blankets that made up her bed. I pulled back to look at her, to make sure she was good. She smiled, grabbed my braid, and brought me back to her. I can't say how long we were there before the song interrupted us, but when I caught my breath and came out into that bowl of the valley, it was full dark. It was impossible to ignore for a few reasons. For one, any sort of noise could bring the predators, so we tried to stay quiet. And then there was the song itself. That's what sent me out of the tent. Do you hear that? She'd whispered through my hair. I'd listened. There it was. Yeah. I'd responded against her neck. We stayed still, just listening to the shake of a dry seed rattle, alert to danger until the singing began. Wigwams. Now I stood near the fire pit and set my feet in the direction of his voice. It was a low, moaning voice, the kind the body used to travel through pain, the kind a child uses when they realize the higher pitched tone used for bringing their mothers isn't working, and they are alone after all. From the back entrance of the cave, I saw several guards. They too were listening, but since they stayed there by the doorway, I guess they weren't too concerned, and we weren't in any imminent danger. I found Mick by the southwest wall. He'd lit a smudge and a candle so that his face was clear in the handful of light and obscured by the handfuls of smoke. I stood back a bit while he sang, knocking his rattle against the air and rocking on his heels where he rested. It was warmer outside, and the wind in this valley was minimal. Mick wore a t-shirt and black jeans without the burden of coats, and I was reminded of his life outside of us. The scars from his old school stay, the tattoo of a feather below his collarbone, the outline of the buffalo on the back of his hand. His hair was longer than usual, and the sides grown in so he seemed younger, less severe. His duct-tape boots were pulled off his feet and placed at the edge of the light where he sat. I waited until he was done singing, until after he had mumbled some words and smudged himself. I waited still while he settled into a more relaxed, cross-legged position, and even when he packed up his rattle and docked a feather. I waited. Well, come here then. He didn't look up as he put away his bundle. I came into the light and sat opposite him, mimicking his cross-legged pose. You still up? It was an odd question that he didn't mean, since obviously I was still up. What he meant was, why was I still up? Haven't made it to my tent yet. I meant it to sound nonchalant, but his return smile made me blush. Rose must be lonely in that tent by herself. I squirmed a bit. It's okay, boy. All I'm going to say is babies are the most important thing we have to move ahead. So when they come, they need to come to families that want them and are ready to take responsibility. It's not like, we're not. He held up his hand. Don't worry. No need to explain to me. You're a good man, French. I already know that. We sat in silence for a minute before I switched gears, the uncomfortable subject making it easier to ask what I really wanted. Miig, are you okay? Are any of us okay? No, really. I leaned in to touch his knee. I needed him to know I was serious. You seem weird since we got here. Just since we got here? He smirked, then waved away his own lightheartedness. I know what you mean, French. He gathered the edges of his buckskin bundle and tied them off. Just tired, I guess. Yeah, all this running. No, I'm just more tired of missing Isaac is all. Just an old man with an old love, I guess. All this talk about Minerva and the schools must have brought up a lot of unresolved feelings for him. I thought about him pouring 100 vials into the ground, one by one, mourning his partner. Well, I wasn't sure what to say. We'll get Minerva, and then we'll shut them down, all of them. He looked me in the eyes, the first time since I'd sat down. I know you will, Francis. I know you will.